All right, so you all sent in some sources, and we've been digging into them. And, well, frankly, some of the stuff we've been reading is pretty remarkable. It's been argued that, get this, that more significant things for the kingdom of God happened between, like, 1800 and 2000
Yeah.
than in all the centuries before that combined. I mean, that's a huge claim, right? You really got to wonder what was so special about those 200 years.
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating, and this is really what jumped out from the sources you sent, is how much our understanding of Christian mission has changed over that time. It's not just about the church getting bigger. It's like a fundamental shift in how the church sees its role in the world.
Yeah, exactly. And the framework that seemed to come up again and again in what you sent was this idea of 3 mission eras. It's laid out by a guy named Ralph D. Winter. And this idea, it's like a really helpful way to think about how Christian outreach has developed since 1800. So for this deep dive, we really want to break down these 3 eras for you. What were the big ideas behind each one? And how do they connect to not just the growth of the church, but to this bigger picture of God's will being done here on earth, in all of life?
And this brings us to a really important distinction that Winter makes. He talks about the difference between something he calls church mission and something he calls kingdom mission. Now, church mission, in this context, it's basically about bringing people to faith in Christ, right? Growing the church globally. But then there's kingdom mission, which is more about, well, it's more about Christians and the church working to see God's values, his principles reflected out there in the world. So it's impacting society, transforming culture, addressing issues that go beyond the walls of the church.
So to make sure I'm getting this, church mission is focused on making disciples and bringing people into the church. In kingdom mission, that sounds like it's more about living out your faith, making a tangible difference, even working with people who might not share your beliefs. Would that be a fair way to put it?
That's a really good way to understand it. Winter's argument is that the Great Commission, it's not just about making converts, it's about teaching those converts to obey, like literally everything Jesus said, you know? So it's bigger than just getting people to join a church. It's about living out a Christian worldview in all areas of life and working towards a world that reflects God's justice and his love, regardless of who is doing the work. Both of these aspects, church mission and kingdom mission, they're both super important and they really work together.
Okay, so let's dive into this first era then, 1800 to 1910. The sources really paint this picture of Protestant missions exploding onto the scene during this period. What was going on in the world that led to this surge?
Well, think about the historical context for a second. Around 1800, Catholic missions, they'd been a major force for centuries, right? Well, they started facing huge disruptions because of the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars that came after. So that kind of created a bit of a vacuum, a space for Protestants to step in. And then at the same time, you have this huge evangelical awakening happening in England and America. And the spiritual revival, it instilled this intense personal faith in people and this deep conviction that they needed to share that faith with the world globally. So you have this combination of things happening, global politics shifting, this surge in spiritual energy among Protestants. It was a really unique moment.
And then a figure like William Carey really steps onto the stage during this time, right?
Yeah.
And he's crucial, isn't he? The sources really highlighted him as this leader in taking Protestant missions outside of Europe. But it doesn't seem like his vision was limited to just, converting individuals. It sounds like he had this much broader kingdom of God perspective right from the start.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Carey was a visionary. He was pushing for a mission that went way beyond just like getting people to say a prayer and, change their label. He was deeply invested in the overall well-being of the people he wanted to reach. Like, he was a big advocate for education. He championed translating the Bible into languages people could actually understand. And he was really challenging those social norms that he saw as harmful. And, a lot of the missionary efforts that came after him, they involved setting up schools, even universities. And I think that really underscores this commitment to like this holistic transformation. It wasn't just spiritual, it was practical. Like, a key takeaway from this early period is that the most effective mission work tends to link sharing the gospel with actually trying to make people's lives better. And this kingdom focus, I think, is going to be a theme we see pop up again and again as we go along.
It's easy to see these missionary movements as, springing up out of nowhere. But the sources also point to a bunch of important events that kind of laid the groundwork for all of this. Can you walk us through some of these key things that made this era of expansion possible?
Sure. Let's step back even further, like way back to the printing press, 1450 or so. That was a game changer. All of a sudden, you could make copies of the Bible and other Christian writings on a scale that was like unimaginable before. And that really fueled the Reformation. This whole idea that Christianity wasn't tied to any one culture, that it could take root anywhere, that was huge. And then a little later, you have this great European migration kicking off with, Columbus in 1492. And that spreads European influence all over the globe. And I mean, like it or not, that opens up a lot of new pathways for Christianity to spread, often, hand in hand with colonialism. And then we can't forget the Catholics. Between 1600 and 1800, they were sending missionaries like crazy. These dedicated folks, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, they were going all over the world. So all of these things happening, ideas spreading, people moving around, it really created this foundation for the Protestant missions that would explode in the 19th century.
Wow, it's amazing how all those threads weave together. But this push for Protestant missions, it wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms everywhere, was it? The sources mentioned that there was some pretty strong opposition.
Oh, yeah, you're right. There was definitely pushback. And not just from people within the church, but from secular leaders as well. Like, take Britain, for example. The government and the East India Company, they were super wary of missionaries going to India. They were worried about upsetting trade, causing social unrest. It took a lot of pressure, a lot of lobbying from those evangelical folks in Parliament to finally convince them to allow missionaries in. And that wasn't until 1813. So, yeah, this expansion of missions, it wasn't always smooth sailing.
And back in America, after the War of 1812, we see the Second Great Awakening. And that wasn't just a religious revival, was it? It had a ripple effect across society, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The Second Great Awakening, it lasted from about 1815 to 1861. It was a period of just incredible religious passion, and it definitely had a huge social impact. I mean, all these voluntary societies popped up. People were tackling issues like slavery, alcoholism, poverty. It was amazing. Some historians even talk about this time as like an evangelical empire. And there were these powerful preachers, people like Charles Finney, who were pushing for both personal conversion and social change.
But it wasn't all, positive developments. The sources did point out some less favorable aspects, this creativity, good and not so good.
Yeah.
What were some of the downsides?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, whenever you have this kind of religious energy, you're going to get new movements, new interpretations of scripture. Some of them fit in with the mainstream and some go in totally different directions. Like during this time, you had groups like the Millerites, you had the early Mormons, you had Christian Science popping up. And of course, all the while, there were positive social reforms happening too. And even within existing denominations, you had internal conflicts, like that big Presbyterian split in 1837. It shows you how dynamic and kind of, unpredictable things can be when you have all this religious growth and change happening so fast.
Now, one of the more complex and, at times really troubling aspects of this era was the relationship between missions and that whole idea of manifest destiny in America. Can you talk a bit more about how those two things played out?
Yeah, that's definitely a sensitive area. See, this idea of manifest destiny, this belief that America was destined by God to expand across the continent, it unfortunately got mixed up with some missionary efforts, and that led to people justifying taking land from Native Americans, mistreating them even. It's really awful. One really horrifying example is California's bounty law. It basically paid people for the scalps of Native Americans. I mean, can you believe that? That's the dark side of this idea, and it's a stark contrast to earlier Franciscan missionaries in the same area. They were working within a colonial system, sure, but they often tried to protect the Native people. It's just a tragic example of how religious belief can get twisted and used to do really terrible things.
But amidst all this, there was one really interesting and surprisingly positive outcome of the Civil War. The growing role of women in missions. It's something the sources highlighted, and it's worth spending some time on, I think.
It's remarkable, isn't it? You had all this loss of life, all this social upheaval because of the war, and that created all these new needs, new opportunities, and women stepped up. They took on leadership roles in ways they hadn't been able to before. And that included a big increase in their involvement in missions. They started founding women's colleges specifically to train women to be missionaries. Women's mission boards run entirely by women. They were popping up everywhere, supporting and directing all these missionary endeavors. And then you had these interdenominational movements like the Young People's Society of Christian Endeavor, which was hugely influential. They fed right into the student volunteer movement, and women were leading in that as well. It's really inspiring to see how these movements were laying the groundwork for women to have a much bigger influence in missions in the coming decades. And these are holistic movements committed to both church mission and kingdom mission.
Okay, so that brings us to the second era, which runs from about 1865 to 1980. It seems like things shifted both geographically with this move towards inland territories and conceptually with this idea of a loss of kingdom mission coming into play. What were the biggest changes during this time?
So one striking thing about the Second Era is that missionaries started focusing more on inland regions, going beyond those coastal areas that were the initial focus. A prime example of that is J. Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission. They were real pioneers working in parts of China that had never seen Protestant missionaries before. And another interesting thing is they operated on this faith principle. Basically, they relied on God's provision instead of guaranteed funding. That was a big shift in how missions were funded and organized.
But it also sounds like there was this growing split in how people understood the mission itself, almost like a clash of priorities.
That's right. A real divide started to form. On one side, you had people who were really zeroing in on personal salvation and individual conversion. That was the main goal for them. Church mission front and center. This perspective was popular with, folks who had gone to college and those connected to all these new Bible institutes that were springing up. But then on the other side, you had the folks who were carrying on the more holistic vision of the First Era. They saw mission as encompassing both evangelism and social transformation, church mission and kingdom mission going hand in hand. This viewpoint was more common among people who had gone to college, especially those associated with the older mainline denominations. So a key shift in this era is that these two crucial aspects of mission, they start to become separated in people's minds and in their actions.
And it seems like that difference in emphasis, it even affected how people thought about civilizing the people they were trying to reach. It wasn't just about good manners, was it? It was about some deeper philosophical differences.
Yeah, absolutely. The understanding of what it meant to civilize someone, it varied a lot. For some, it meant things like teaching people to read and write, improving basic living conditions, addressing harmful cultural practices, all of that alongside sharing the gospel. But then for others, the focus became much more narrow. It was all about presenting this heaven-oriented personal fulfillment gospel, and they didn't pay as much attention to those broader social issues.
And you can really see those different approaches playing out if you compare, like, what J. Hudson Taylor was initially focused on with the work of someone like Timothy Richard in China. They were both working in China at the same time, weren't they?
Exactly. Taylor, his initial passion was all about reaching those who had never heard the gospel, especially those in the interior of China. And his mission, it was super impactful. They eventually expanded their work to include stuff like medical care and education, but that wasn't the initial focus. It was all about direct evangelism at first. But then you have Timothy Richard, who was also working in China around the same time, but he was college educated, and his approach was much broader from the get-go. He believed in engaging with Chinese society on multiple levels. Like, he pushed for educational reforms, and he saw transforming society, like the whole fabric of society, as part of God's mission. Now, to be fair, Taylor's mission did evolve over time, but those two figures, they really represent the spectrum of approaches you saw in this era.
And this polarization, it even seems to have played out along socioeconomic lines, doesn't it? Like with a growing working class among evangelicals who are maybe more focused on that message of personal salvation.
That's a really sharp observation. See, as industrialization and urbanization took hold, you saw this rise in the working class, and a lot of them were evangelicals. And their focus, it makes sense, it gravitated towards that message of personal salvation in heaven. It offered comfort, hope in a world that was often pretty rough. But then you contrast that with the college-educated evangelicals, often from more comfortable backgrounds, who were very active in movements like the student volunteer movement. And while they were definitely focused on global evangelism, they also tended to have this strong social reform element in their work.
So basically, this difference in understanding and priorities, it ended up creating these separate streams within the broader missionary movement. You had different organizations, different affiliations popping up.
Yeah, exactly. On the one hand, you had groups organizing these big ecumenical conferences. They were all about unity across denominations, and they often advocated for the church to have a bigger role in society and politics. This was a driving force behind the formation of the World Council of Churches. But then you had another group that was more concerned with sticking to specific doctrines and, making sure people's conversions were genuine. They tended to start Bible schools and independent missions. They were more hesitant about those ecumenical alliances.
Now, the first half of the 20th century, it was a wild ride, wasn't it? You had all these huge global events, a lot of them devastating, and it seems like those events might have reinforced a more pessimistic outlook among some evangelicals, maybe contributing to that decline in emphasis on kingdom mission that we've been talking about.
It's interesting, isn't it, how much these secular events can shape people's theology. I mean, you think about it. The Boxer Rebellion, the Titanic sinking, World War I, and all that destruction, the global flu pandemic, the Great Depression, and then World War II on top of it all, it was a lot to process. And for a lot of evangelicals, it created this feeling of disillusionment, this pessimism about humanity's ability to make the world a better place. And that led many of them to focus even more on the second coming of Christ. That was their ultimate hope. And sometimes that focus on the future kind of overshadowed efforts to transform society in the here and now. But, there's also a paradox here because World War II, even with all the suffering it caused, it actually inspired a ton of new mission agencies to form. These were groups focused on traditional evangelism, driven by this urge to share the gospel in a world that was, well, pretty broken.
And as we move further into the second era, the sources point out a decline in the number of missionaries being sent out from some of the mainline denominations. And it seems like there was also this shift in how they even defined mission itself.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of the older, more established denominations, they started sending fewer missionaries. And that went along with this theological shift where they increasingly defined mission as, well, mainly about planting churches, starting new congregations. And while that's definitely important, it's a bit more narrow than the vision of those earlier missionaries who were involved in all those social programs. So this further contributes to that sense that kingdom mission, it wasn't as much of a priority during this time.
So that brings us to this third era, roughly 1935 to the present day. And this era, it seems to be characterized by this new focus on unreached peoples and what looks like a recovery of kingdom mission. Can you tell us about the people who were really instrumental in shaping this era?
Sure. They are two key figures who both had their roots in the student volunteer movement, William Cameron Townsend and Donald McGavran. Townsend, he was struck by the need for Bible translation, especially for those tribal groups all over the world, the ones who were often overlooked. And that led him to start Wycliffe Bible Translators. And McGavran, his focus was a bit different. He was looking at those social and cultural barriers to spreading the gospel. He stressed the importance of reaching what he called homogeneous units, or people groups, even in places that already had some Christians.
So Townsend is focused on language, and McGavran is focused on people groups. Those are really big insights, aren't they? But when you say homogeneous units, I think some people might not immediately get what that means.
You're right. It's a bit of jargon, isn't it? Townsend's big idea was that people can only truly understand and connect with the gospel if they can read it in their heart language, the language that speaks to their soul. And his work with Wycliffe, it made people aware of just how many languages there are in the world that didn't have a Bible. And McGavran, he pointed out that people who are similar culturally and socially, they tend to be more open to the gospel. Homogeneous units, those are basically groups who share those cultural or social traits, like language, ethnicity, or social class. He said that if you can reach people within those existing social structures through existing believers in those groups, he called that the bridge of God, the gospel is more likely to take root and spread naturally. He argued that we need a missiological breakthrough to reach these groups. And his work, it led to the founding of Fuller School of World Mission and to the rise of those church growth and frontier mission movements.
Now, the sources mention this big gathering, the Edinburgh 1980 World Consultation on Frontier Missions, as being a turning point in this third era. Why was that particular event so significant?
Edinburgh 1980 was a landmark event because it really shifted the focus of global missions onto reaching those unreached peoples. Those are the people who don't have the Bible in their own language and who don't have a strong Christian communities within our culture. And it was a huge gathering, the biggest meeting of mission leaders and practitioners ever up to that point. And a really key thing about Edinburgh 1980 is that there was a much bigger presence from non-Western mission agencies, what were then called Third World missions. This signaled a growing global awareness and commitment to reaching those who had historically been kind of ignored.
And that focus on unreached peoples, it led to the creation of new mission organizations, and it even changed the strategies of some of the older ones, didn't it?
Totally. You see all these new mission agencies springing up specifically to reach these unreached groups. And they were using creative strategies, new technologies, all kinds of things. And even some of the long-standing mission groups, they started rethinking their priorities, adapting their approaches to focus on these previously neglected communities. And there's been this growing realization that unreached peoples, it's not just about remote tribes, It includes all sorts of different groups, people of all different ethnicities, languages, and social backgrounds in every part of the world. And reaching them requires these really tailored, culturally sensitive strategies.
It's really interesting that the sources point out this irony. While you have these older, mainline denominations sending fewer missionaries, the newer evangelical missions, a lot of them staffed by people with college degrees, they're embracing this broader understanding of the gospel that includes things like, relief work, development work, stuff like that.
Right. It's fascinating. It's like some of the older denominations had become a bit wary of anything that wasn't strictly evangelism. But then you have these newer evangelical missions. And maybe it's because this generation of missionaries was more educated, had a more global perspective, but they really started to connect the dots between sharing the gospel and addressing people's practical needs. And the amount of money being donated to relief and development organizations, especially within evangelical circles, that really shows you that there's a growing commitment to a more holistic kind of mission.
So it seems like the third era is all about getting more specific about who the nations are that still need to be reached, and about bringing back that emphasis on the kingdom side of mission. But the sources also point out that there are still these tensions, these ongoing debates in the Christian world about the best way to approach missions.
Yeah, for sure. While there's been this huge resurgence of interest in kingdom mission in a lot of Christian circles, those old tensions haven't completely disappeared. Like if you remember back to those fundamentalist, modernist controversies in the early 20th century, there were these big debates about the authority of Scripture and the role of the church in society, and that still has a subtle influence on how some Christians think about social action.
Okay.
How does social action fit in with evangelism? Those questions are still there.
And even today, it seems like you have this spectrum in the broader Christian world where some groups emphasize personal experience, some emphasize theological precision, and some emphasize social engagement, and, every combination in between.
The Christian world is diverse, right? Different groups focus on different things. So you see some movements that are super into charismatic gifts. They put a big emphasis on experiencing God, sometimes with a less developed theological framework. And then you have others in that same charismatic world who are like, hey, wait a minute, we need to be more careful. We need more theological depth. And as the sources point out, you even have this divide within mission scholarship itself. You have groups like the Association of Scholars of Mission, ASM, and the Evangelical Missiological Society, EMS, and they tend to come from different theological and institutional backgrounds. It just shows you that there are all these different perspectives on mission, even among the experts.
One critique that really stood out to me in the sources was this idea that there isn't really a widespread, fully developed concept of a gospel of the kingdom that really integrates the everyday work of ordinary Christians. It's like that whole idea of work as mission is still underdeveloped.
You're right. That's a really crucial point that the sources bring up. It's like there's this disconnect between how we talk about ministry and the daily lives of most Christians. Full-time Christian service, that term often gets reserved for people who work in churches or, explicitly religious organizations. But that leaves out all these other people who are working in all these different fields. Business, education, the arts, they're out there living their faith too, and their work is just as important for building God's kingdom. Those sources are challenging us to move past this idea that mission is something you do on Sundays or at church events. They're saying we need this 24/7 vision of kingdom mission, where every aspect of a believer's life, every job, every task, it's lived in obedience to God, and it's contributing to his will being done here on earth.
Another thing the sources critique is this tendency to approach missions and good works individually. Like it's all about individual acts of charity. And they call for a more organized, strategic effort.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to tackling these huge global problems.
Yeah.
The comparison they make to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that was pretty eye-opening, I thought.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Those sources are saying that, sure, individual acts of kindness are important, but they're not going to be enough to fix these massive systemic issues we're facing, like poverty, disease. Those problems are so big, they need organized, well-funded, strategic efforts. And individual actions alone, they're just not going to cut it. They point to groups like the Gates Foundation, which are pouring resources and expertise into global health and development, and they're making a real impact. And they're basically saying, hey, Christians, we can do this too. We can be just as organized and strategic in our efforts to meet these huge needs.
And the sources, they end with this really powerful call to give our utmost for his highest, and to see following Jesus as like an active fight against the forces of evil. It really adds the sense of urgency and purpose to the whole conversation.
It's true. At the end of the day, those sources are calling us to have a radical, all-encompassing understanding of our faith. It's not just about getting ourselves into heaven. It's about actively participating in God's work of redeeming and restoring the world right here, right now. It's about putting God's goals ahead of our own comfort and being willing to invest everything we have in building his kingdom and fighting against anything that opposes it.
So looking back over these three eras, we've seen this incredible journey. It starts with this burst of global missions and this really holistic vision. Then you have a period of expansion geographically, but the focus narrows in on personal salvation. And then finally, you have this contemporary era where there's a renewed focus on the unreached and a rediscovery of that broader kingdom vision. It's a complex story full of inspiring progress and moments where, well, we can see there's still room for growth and deeper understanding.
The important thing is to see how these different eras have shaped missions and the global church today. The tension between focusing on evangelism and focusing on social change, that's a theme that runs through the whole story. And it's still shaping how Christians understand their role in the world.
So thinking about everything we've talked about, the history, the challenges that are still out there, I want to ask you, the listener, a question. How do you see your own life, your own work, fitting into this bigger picture of God's mission in the world? And that includes both within the church and in your everyday life. It's not limited to one or the other.
That's such a powerful question for each of us to wrestle with. I mean, as we've been talking about these unreached peoples and all the different ways kingdom mission can look, it makes you think, what are my unique skills, my passions, my resources? How can I use them to help address these crucial needs and opportunities we've been talking about?
It really feels like our discussion today, it's just the start. It's a reminder of just how vast God's mission is and that we're all called to engage in it thoughtfully, prayerfully, and actively.